Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where Dr. Ross, Christian, and Brian host national experts who share ideas to manage money and the home as teammates. Today's guest is Rahkim Sabree. Rahkim is an author, Forbes columnist, and financial coach who focuses on the intersection of financial education and financial trauma as a barrier to achieving financial empowerment. His work has been seen or published in many of the large publications, including Business Insider, Black Enterprise, Entrepreneur, Money Group, Parents Magazine, and more. For today's show, we will focus on how to overcome financial trauma. So without further ado, let's begin.
Rahkim, really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I love your writing. I follow what you share on social media, which quite a bit of it has been, if I'm correct, I think I'm correct in saying Forbes. And you do such a great job, approaching important niches, but in particular for what I want to talk about today, financial trauma. And we're going to dive into obviously many topics. But can you just describe or define what financial trauma is?
Sure. So financial trauma is any instance observed or experienced that has a negative impact on the way that you view, interact with, or believe about money.
Give me an example of some sort of financial trauma that might have happened to somebody like in their childhood that could be influencing their relationship with money today as an adult.
Yeah, so I love this question because financial trauma exists on a spectrum of sorts, right? So there's little t trauma, right? And then that could be you on social media seeing Kim Kardashian endorse cryptocurrency, right? And you dump your life savings into crypto based off of that influence, which would probably lead to a bigger trauma. But big T trauma is the direct experience of some traumatic event, right? So that can be losing a job, experiencing an eviction, repossession, bankruptcy. And so you, as a child, specific to your question, as a child, if you witness instances of trauma that occur within your household that maybe you are impacted by directly or your parents are impacted by directly. And so as a result, you feel kind of the emotional strain and stress and pressure associated. Well, that's trauma, happening or that you're experiencing. And what's really interesting is that most of our beliefs about money are pretty solidified by the time we're 7. So when we think So when we think about what's happening in our life or what happened in our life, what was the modeling or the value that was placed on money during that period of time in our life, and then maybe what was the sustained kind of MO, if you will, as it relates to that belief system. Well, then when you go out into the world as an independent adult, it's kind of difficult to first recognize this is the pattern of thought that we have when it comes to money, but even more so difficult to kind of unravel that and change what the behavior looks like because of so much conditioning associated with those beliefs.
And that's really at a time where, and maybe I'm not speaking correctly here, but it's been my experience that when your children are young, oftentimes that's when it's hardest on you financially. We had our first child relatively young, so there's naturally some financial stress. And I don't have the data in front of me, but I've seen that is the kind of the trend that you have children, before the age of 30 oftentimes. And I know that's changing, but that's a little unnerving to realize that, wow, before the age of 7, that there's such a dramatic effect in your relationship to money at a time when there is, I suppose it'd be more likely that you would experience financial trauma in those circumstances. So let's say, I know, I'm sure you hate when I, give an example and you're like, well, I know there's a lot of factors.
Go ahead.
Let's say that you lived in a house where there's like financial enmeshment, where like you have, parents who are oversharing and creating trauma as a result of that. What kinds of problems would that manifest into as an adult?
So difficult question to answer, right? Because everybody's situation is different. But I'll play along. Certainly, I think um, there's something to be said about introducing financial principles and concepts and even practices to
Yeah.
young people before they are able to make these decisions on their own. And I think some of that positive modeling, or at least the intention behind that quote unquote positive modeling, is really so that you can prepare the child for what adulthood is going to look like. However, I think kind of like the idea of toxic positivity, where children, or in the realm of toxic positivity, people are going through the motions of things that would on the surface look very positive, but really it's having a negative impact on them psychologically, physically even. And I think the same thing kind of can occur financially, right? If there is the modeling of behavior that places an emphasis on money for children as being kind of like this pedestal, so to speak, then the child can grow up maybe so there are money scripts coined by Dr. Brad Clonson. One of them that's coming to my mind is like money worship, right? Where money is the thing, right? We're doing everything that we can so that we could get more money. And there's I'm having dissonance here because as a financial educator, starting in very generalized financial education, there's a lot of concepts that go to like paying yourself first and budgeting and saving, all of those things that we hear. But then there's also like, when I hear the word frugal now, frugal has a neutral connotation, but these days have more of a negative connotation to me because it's like this idea of opting to deny yourself of maybe experiences, of maybe quality, so that you can hold on to more of your money. And through certain lenses, in like the traditional world of personal finance, right? When you take the feelings and the emotions and the psychology out of it, well, that's being viewed as a positive behavior. And so what's interesting about this question and really about this space is that it's so nuanced based off of the individual, and not only the behavior that we're able to judge from the perspective of, well, is this a good money behavior or a bad money behavior, but the intent behind the behavior, like, why are you doing this thing? Because there is something called financial hoarding, right? So you're going out and you're getting paid good money that can maybe facilitate or allow for you to do things, experience things, but you're just like, nope, I experienced some kind of financial trauma as a child, so I want to make sure that I have enough and that I never don't have enough, right? And so instead of enjoying the experiences that money can buy you, you're tucking it all away. Maybe you're storing it under a mattress, or you're storing it in a safe deposit box, or you're just keeping it in an account. So what I do, and kind of, I don't know if I would necessarily call myself a disruptor, but certainly I contribute to that disruptive movement around financial psychology and financial therapy, is hold these instances up for public examination, whether that be through my writing, through mediums like this on podcasts, or even social media, where I'm like, okay, we would look at this situation traditionally through a lens that says this is a positive or negative behavior, but how can we spin that and look at, or at least demonstrate empathy to whoever's going through this circumstance, to say, what is the intent behind this behavior, or what is the trigger that is resulting in this behavior, so that we can kind of make an assessment for ourselves, not just from the perspective of pointing at somebody else and saying, hey, they're doing the right or the wrong thing, but so that we can look introspectively to the things that we do, the things that we say, the things that we encourage, the things that we endorse, etc., and say, well, what is the impact that this is having on me, the people around me, and ultimately the people that are observing or consuming the content that we share.
Yeah, as you're sharing this, my mind is going to the research conducted by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that they integrated into the building blocks, which emphasizes the importance of focusing on social and emotional learning when children are young as a mechanism to teach money, because ultimately there's so many things that about how we feel and our interactions with other people that are going to drive our decisions. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about some of the lessons that Others have told me that they've used to teach their children through money, and it doesn't have anything to do with budgeting. It might be to teach them generosity by participating in giving, or teaching them patience by rewarding them for saving. So the really what the intention is, and Ron Lieber brought this up, he was a past guest and he was the author of The Opposite of Spoiled, is how can you use money as a tool kind of to teach values and to teach the types of, you know, restraint and kindness that you want your children to have. So I'm glad you put it that way, because that's not something that the everyday person would know, right? Like on the surface, you would just think when they're 5 or 6, you want to play with coins and you want to identify dollars, and you're looking at it more mechanically, but it's not that simple, is it?
Yeah, no, I think beyond, like, I refer to it as the math, right? But I love the example that you gave, even just kind of differentiating between the value of coins and fiat, like currency, right? There's also what you don't say, right? It's what children observe from their parents. So are they stressing about what bill gets paid? Is there's a popular kind of saying within the Black community, at least when I was growing up, where kids would ask their parents for McDonald's, driving past the McDonald's or walking past the McDonald's, and the mom would say, well, do you have McDonald's money? And just like so many Black people who were, with at least in my generation and prior, have that shared experience without knowing each other, without, you know, their parents knowing each other. It's just like that's the phrase that mom said. But, you know, if there is this concept of scarcity that says, well, we can't have it, or we can't have it but on special occasions, or I mean, even we look at something like Santa, right, for Christmas, and, you know, who's doing the gift giving, and what gifts can we get, and, you know, how is that influencing the child's belief about what their parents are capable of or have access to financially, whether or not they're able to meet their wants and or needs. And I'm not in any way endorsing that children should get everything that they ask for, but I think some of the examples that parents demonstrate in their interactions with children that don't have anything to do with money have everything to do with money.
Well said. So let's shift gears a little bit. I would love for you to share your journey, you know, through entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. So I have kind of dabbled in entrepreneurship for a while, since 2014, I want to say. I had read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad probably a year or two.
I love that. I love that book.
Yeah, I did. I like the book. I like the book.
Yes, we'll leave it there. Yes, correct. Yes, we'll leave it there.
So I read Rich Dad Poor Dad. It was gifted to me, and I ended up just becoming so consumed by the Rich Dad content. And I think I was on Facebook or somewhere. I saw an advertisement that they were having a free seminar local to me. So I'm like, I have to go to this. I'm thinking at the time that Robert Kiyosaki himself was going to be there. And I go, right? So it's a free seminar. And of course, the whole time they're selling you on the paid seminar. Right. So I go and I pay for the paid seminar. And that's a 3-day seminar. And the whole time they're selling you on the advanced training. It's always an upsell.
Yeah.
So through that experience, there was like this heavy emphasis on like, you can leave here and become a real estate investor. And so I bought into the sales pitch, if you will. And I went out, I started an LLC, and I'm like, all right, I'm a business owner, I'm a CEO, right? And I thought I wanted to be a real estate investor, but then I realized very quickly that I just didn't have the time to commit to it. I didn't have the expertise, and there's no way that I would have gained the expertise in 3 days. I'm realizing this in hindsight, right? I did end up paying for the advanced training, which is a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But even with that, I didn't feel confident to go out and like start doing what it was that they were teaching us conceptually. But I already had the LLC. And so I'm like, well, maybe I'll just kind of refocus my business model on consulting. And at the time I was working in banking. So there was some concern about there being a potential conflict of interest, because the consulting would focus mostly on financial education. And so I did that every day. I was working with clients. They would come in, open up accounts. I'm telling them, like, you should do this, you should do that, you should not do this. This is how credit cards work. Do you want to apply with the credit card, et cetera, et cetera. And the moment that I realized that I was good at this was a couple came into the bank. They were considering getting married. The fiance, would-be husband at that particular point in time, had a truck with 19% interest rate on it that he was paying. And the other fiance, would-be wife, she had savings, she had income. She came from a family with money, but they wanted to go out on their own. They wanted to buy a house. They needed to get their stuff together. So I invited them to meet with me at a Starbucks, not too far from the branch location. After work on a Saturday, we went to actually it was a Barnes and Noble that had a Starbucks inside. So we sat down, I created a whole like plan for them, wrote it out. And at the end of it, they're like, okay, we feel good about this. How much do we owe you? And I'm like, you don't. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, you don't. Like, this is what I do. I like doing this. And I didn't realize how much value I had given away at that particular point in time. But they came back some months later just to thank me because they were able to pay off the truck, take from the savings that they had, pay off the truck, start to reestablish savings, and then begin going through the home buying process. And I'm just like, wow, that's amazing, great. And I kind of did it just casually with my friends and my family too, like just what I knew I would share. And so once I left that particular role, I decided to kind of focus on it in a personal branding capacity. But I wanted to do it through speaking. I wanted to do it through writing. And so really things started to take off for me in 2019. I published my second book, Financially Irresponsible. I delivered a TEDx talk on financial empowerment. And I'm like in a completely different role, working for a bank, not customer facing. But entrepreneurship, I've been telling people full-time entrepreneurship. So there's no support from like the corporate gig has been over the last 2 years for me. And actually it's 2 years this month. May 28th, I believe, will be the 2-year anniversary of me leaving my job. And that has been a completely different journey, full of up and downs. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. You're navigating just really kind of like through the darkness, right? Within a business model that doesn't really exist, right? So you're kind of building as you're flying, and the plane's on fire, right? And like there's so much going on, but observing how different people structure and run their businesses, and then maybe pulling what works from them and trying to apply it for me. So I have gone the freelancing route. I have gone the consulting route. I've gone the coaching route. I've gone the B2B consulting route. And that's currently where my focus is. But there's also a B2C component. So there's like so many different pieces. The issue over the last 2 years, as I'm starting to come out with some clarity, is that because there were so many competing business structures that I was entertaining, there wasn't no one structure that I was really committing to. And so with all of that confusion, and I didn't realize that it was confusion at the time, but with all of that confusion, I'm doing all of the right things and I'm developing all of, the right little pieces, but it's not this one cohesive unit that says, this is what I do, this is what people know I do, this is how I'm going to market the business and establish pricing. So over the last year, definitely year and a half, I've been heavily focused on just one thing. And that's talking about financial trauma through the lens of financial psychology and financial therapy. And I've had just some amazing success with that in terms of establishing myself as an authority. Most times when people hear financial trauma, at least people that are connected to me, they're like, oh, Rahkim Sabree, like that's your guy. And what I'm noticing happen kind of organically, but completely unintentionally, is that I'm moving away from the personal finance community and I'm moving into the mental health community. And there is a void there when it comes to conversations around money management, because it's not a focus. It's certainly an impact, right? Their clients are coming in, their clients are stressed about money. And I'm talking about therapists specifically.
Sure.
but they don't have the training or the background to address what some of those issues are from the math perspective, right? The 1+1=2, but also from the clinical perspective that says, okay, this is what the issue is. This is how I'm recognizing this issue manifest in your life. Here are the steps that you can take to de-escalate. And the bonus for me is that some of these therapists also have these issues that they need to address within themselves. So it's created kind of a new organic audience for me that I'm exploring and kind of dabbling in as the time passes by. But it's been a journey. I've accomplished a lot in 2 years, and I'm looking forward to what else comes next.
Well, that leads to the next question, which it also involves, really what we often talk about on this podcast, and clearly what we share on Modern Husbands, which is that personal finance or financial literacy isn't enough, particularly in the world of partnership or marriage, however you want to define that commitment to one another, because there's so much more to it than the nuts and bolts, right? Like how to build a budget. And I would love to hear from your perspective why financial literacy in itself, that is focusing on the nuts and bolts, how to invest, how to build credit. Why is that alone not enough?
Yeah, such a loaded question, right? So I talk about financial trauma through the lens of a greater generational trauma that impacts Black Americans specifically. And so when I niche in that way, or I communicate my findings in that way, a lot of the feedback that I have for the personal finance community is exactly what you said. The personal finance or financial literacy is not enough. And the reason why I feel so strongly and why I state that so strongly is because oftentimes there's just like, oh, well, we need to create a program, we need to create a curriculum, we need to educate more people, and then that will solve poverty, right? That will close the wealth gap. And what it's really doing is it's ignoring the variables that created the trauma in the first place, right? It's just kind of like, oh, well, here's the Band-Aid. And so zooming out, right? Taking it outside of the lens of just the Black community for a second. When we look at communities holistically, financial literacy by itself is not enough because it doesn't address how we feel, what we believe, what our experiences are, and the nuances of person-to-person experience that influence ultimately all of the quote unquote quote math, or like you said, the nuts and bolts of it, right? So yeah, people can know how to budget, but are they budgeting, right? People can know how credit works, but are they managing credit effectively? And what I found through my own experience, like my lived experience, is that people who are experiencing poverty a lot of times know what they should be doing, but are not empowered to do those things because they have to make choices out of survival, or because it's just what is the most convenient in that moment, right? And so I try to demonstrate a lot of, and it's not a hard try, right? Because I'm not so far removed from the experience of poverty, empathy in how people approach the decisions that they make financially, because I'll give I think a rock star example that I saw maybe last year sometime. There was a content creator who had shared that this whole thesis they created, right, on lifestyle inflation. And it was that what was good enough for you yesterday is no longer good enough for you today because you're making more money. And so you can't go and wear the same clothes and eat the same food and have the same experiences because it's not good enough for you anymore. And the way that they were positioning it was as a negative. And I'm like, wow, like that is a very unempathetic approach to this topic of quote unquote lifestyle inflation, because what if you didn't have a car and you lived in an area that sure, had public transportation, but now instead of what takes maybe 10 to 30 minutes driving, you have to spend 2 hours of your life sitting on a bus. And you add the variables of weather, right? So maybe you're standing outside in the cold. And so you think about the time value of money, right? You're sitting on a bus for 2 hours versus saving all that time to just sit in a car for 30 minutes. Like, no, what was good enough for me yesterday is not good enough for me today. I made more money, so now I want to save time. Or I use another example earlier this year, I think it was, where a lot of the finance bros on Twitter and such, I shared a tweet where it's kind of funny, actually. I shared a tweet where I was debating on buying tacos or going to the supermarket and buying the materials to make my own tacos. And somebody came into the comments and said to me, or you could just buy stock in Taco Bell and get paid to eat tacos. And I kind of laughed at it, right? Like, I laughed because I'm like, yeah, like that was obnoxious. But I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, like, what is if I was hungry and I didn't have means, what is owning stock in Taco Bell going to do for me today? Right. And the same logic is applied to like buying an iPhone or buying a pair of sneakers, right? I used to be one of those guys who's like, well, instead of buying a pair of Jordans, buy Nike stock. Instead of buying a new iPhone, buy Apple stock. But the issue is that the iPhone and the pair of Jordans are going to have a lot more utility for you as an individual than the stocks will. Beyond that, the amount of money that you would invest in Apple that would be equivalent to an iPhone, or that would be, investing in Nike that would be equivalent to a pair of Jordans, is not going to give you a huge yield in terms of dividends or even growth over a period of time. So it's not solving a problem for you right now. And so, we have so much of that kind of mentality that's like, oh, this is the financially literate thing to do. This is the financially responsible thing to do. But it's not the financially empathetic thing to say or do in that moment. And so highlighting the behavior behind why people make the choices that they do, even if they know that they shouldn't do it, answers the question, right? The financial literacy is not enough because it doesn't stop you from making those bad decisions. And in the instances where people don't know any better, the financial literacy is certainly a step, but it's like, how do you remove them from that environment so that they can make better decisions? Or how do you introduce to them behaviors and concepts and modeling that takes them away from what is familiar? Because if it's easier for me to walk down the street and go to check cashing to cash my check than it is for me to go down to a bank, establish a banking relationship and get direct deposit, because I'm afraid, or because I just don't know what to do, or because I don't want to be embarrassed because I don't know what to do, then I'm going to continue going down and paying check cashing because that's what my mom did. That's what my grandmother did. The people know me. Like, we go over there, we can have conversations about Christmas and all the other holidays, right? So there's a convenience factor, there's the ignorance factor, there's the behavioral factor. I mean, there's so many different factors that kind of come in, intersect in that space when we're looking at and judging people for the choices that they make that have nothing to do with their ability to understand this concept of 1 + 1 = 2. I know I should be living on less than what I make, and I should be budgeting, and I should be building credit, and people know that stuff, but they're forced to make decisions that go against what it is that they know. And the last thing I'll say on this, I know this is a very long-winded answer,
but that's a great answer,
is that the dissonance that exists in those instances, right, creates guilt and shame, and even fear in some instances, I would say, because it's like, damn, like, I know that I should be doing better, or I know that I could be doing better, but I have to do this, and now other people are judging me, or I'm judging myself because I believe that I should be doing something different, but I got to do what I got to do to survive. And that's the worst part about it, right? Because even if you don't care about what anybody else says, or you don't know what anybody else is saying, you have to wrestle with those feelings that then create a negative relationship with money that you are managing.
So for the listeners who are particularly interested in understanding why, the first is just recognizing that when people are in poverty, that they're in survival mode. And there were a couple books that stick out to me that really helped me kind of understand the thinking that goes behind making decisions when you're trying to survive. Dr. Clausen's Money Mammoth, and then Scarcity. And essentially what those books explain is that when we're in survival mode, we're just using a different part of our brain. We're using the part of our brain that's primal, that is not designed for us to do, the kinds of thinking that are necessary when you sit down and write a budget, right? I mean, you're essentially using the prefrontal cortex when you're writing out a budget or you're managing your credit, and that's not the part of your brain that you're using when you feel like you're being attacked or you feel overwhelmed because you don't know when your next meal is going to come.
Right.
And like the reason I wanted to share that is that, you could have a partner who's gone through that, and, they grew up in an environment like that. And the last thing that you want to do as a partner or as a spouse is make them feel shame for that, make them feel stupid for that. Like, what you should really do is kind of seek to understand it. And I go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, if you don't have your basic needs met, you can't think critically. You can't do it. You have to be able to have your basic needs met. And, something else that you brought up that I think doesn't get enough attention, but that I saw for myself as an educator was the importance of making sure that you expose your children, in my case, it was students, to people who look like them, because they identify more likely to identify with them. Nellie Espinal is a good friend of mine, and she's got a book coming out soon, and she talks about that in the book. And the fact of the matter is that for the last however many years, the personal finance space has been full of kind of like old white dudes, which, there's nothing wrong with, an old white dude or a middle-aged white dude like me trying to help people. But, if that's not kind of what you surrounded yourself with growing up, it's a little bit harder to connect with them. And more importantly, it's harder to understand. Like, banking, just something simple. Like, we learned so much just from our parents and grandparents. Well, if your family was a victim of redlining, then your grandparents probably hate the banks. They're probably telling you, don't go to a bank. They're going to rip you off, because they did rip them off. And so you've got like these generational problems that, unless you are like from that community or highly educated, you can't wrap your mind around like the complicated challenges that you have to break through to help somebody understand why they should get a fixed rate mortgage when it's low. Like, you're throwing numbers at somebody, and that's not even penetrating what is in their history that they're really scared why they're really scared to act on that. So I'm really thankful that you shared that for our listeners, because they need to understand that when they have a relationship with their partners, they should be really empathetic and kind of like seek to understand why they're making the decisions that they are. And that leads to just a mindset, right? So if you were to define the right money mindset, what would that be? What would it look like?
I love your questions, man. So I'm gonna tie your last statement with this question, because something that really stood out that I feel is worth saying, particularly as it relates to partners interacting with one another, or even interacting with children who may have come out of or have experienced financial trauma, right? It's this idea of making people feel like, or not feel like, making people recognize that they are safe. I think that's super important, right? So you talked about how the prefrontal cortex addresses like logical thought, right? And so being able to sit down and do a budget and create this financial plan is that activity. And how the amygdala is firing off in survival mode. That's like, your brain can't distinguish between a real or an imagined threat, right? So if there's a tiger standing in front of you, is the example that I use. And it's the example that somebody gave me, so I keep using. If there's a tiger standing in front of you, or you're stressed out about money, the reaction within your brain is the same, right? The difference in the reaction is that once the tiger goes away, you calm down, but the money issues don't go away unless you address them. And so the sustained threat or perception of a threat makes you feel unsafe in these spaces. And so you start hearing about money, hearing about banking, looking at bills, having numbers thrown at you or jargon that you don't understand. it resurfaces this danger that you can't get away from when you go in your house, when you go in your bed, when you go in your shower, right? And so I think the first step is recognizing that you are safe. And so for me, what that looks like, and I like to use myself as an example because I think it humanizes the experience, right? We all experience financial trauma, particularly as an entrepreneur. For me, what that looks like is, do I have a place to live? Do I have food? Do I have hot water? Like going back to that concept of the hierarchy of needs, right? Are my basic needs satisfied? Cool. That's it. That's all that matters. Now, once I bring myself into the present moment, recognizing that I'm safe through maybe some mindfulness practice or meditation or what have you, then I can start looking at the larger goals and breaking them down into smaller goals, and then, taking action every day, etching away at that. But it's not just like flipping a light switch. It's consistency in understanding what the big picture goal is, understanding what the micro goals that lead up to that is, and constantly reminding yourself that you are safe.
A quick moment of appreciation for our sponsor, Money Marriage University, who delivers self-paced online courses for couples designed by national therapy and financial planning experts. Money Marriage U experts understand how to help couples hurting from arguments and tension around money. Money Marriage U offers a wide variety of online courses at different price points. Take your first step toward healing your pain by visiting moneymarriageuniversity.com. Once again, you can learn more at moneymarriageuniversity.com. Now back to the show.
The last article I wrote for Forbes, I talk about reframing your views of money from looking at it as a prize to looking at it as a tool. Once you start to understand like money is a tool and not just like some reward that you stumble upon walking down the street or scratching off a lottery ticket or gambling at the casino, then the relationship with money becomes different, right? Because how you interact with money becomes different. How you look at money becomes different. And I think to a degree, and I'm thinking as I'm talking, and I'm wanting to sound very empathetic as I share this, that you got to get your hands on some money in order to change your relationship with money too.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to say to somebody who is like struggling, right? Especially if they're living paycheck to paycheck, or if they've experienced probably like, what do you mean I had to get my hands on some money? Of course I know that. How do I do that, right? And I don't get into that conversation because like I know that it's rough, but I also know that it's possible, right? And so whether that's skilling up, whether that's reselling, whether that's building a personal brand, monetizing a skill set that you have into a service, like there's ways to make money. And if you're smart with the money that you have, I don't want to use the word smart. If you cultivate a positive relationship with money and you start exhibiting behaviors around money that are advantageous to you now and in the future, then you insulate yourself in the future from or through circumstances where maybe there's a lack of money. And that's been my experience as an entrepreneur as well, leaving corporate America and having to kind of figure out how to build while the plane is on fire and flying. There's been many months where I've not made money, and I've had to go into money that I've put away, whether that's been invested or saved, to then cover what my living expenses are. But I've been able to sustain myself for 2 years now. So definitely a feat, I think.
Of course.
But looking back at, Rahkim from 5 years ago plus, like, much gratitude for the future thought and saying, okay, like I'm going to start tucking this money away to prepare for whatever that moment is. And I don't even want to call it an emergency, because people look at emergencies as like 6 months to a year, right? And now that we're approaching 2 years, well, we're knocking on 2-year territory's door. Like, even if I had an emergency fund that was funded for that amount, I would have exhausted it by now. So whoever's listening, it's super important to me to share that I'm not theorizing or reciting something out of a book that I heard or read, or something else that somebody said. Like, the lived experiences that I have, I share as a matter of fact because it happened to me. And so it's not like, preaching from a pulpit. It's like, okay, like I've been in the trenches. I know what that feels like. And this is what has worked for me.
So if you were to try to encapsulate like the wisdom that you think is most important in a minute or less, something that the listeners can walk away with and apply to their lives as it pertains to financial trauma. So if one spouse or the other, one partner or the other has in some way experienced big T financial trauma, what would that advice be? Something easy to understand that they can apply in their own relationship.
I think, going back to this idea of recognizing your own safety in the moment. And if you're not safe in the moment, then getting safe. And there are a variety of avenues that you can take to establish that safety. And I've been a huge advocate for financial therapists of late. So these are individuals who are specialized in both a clinical approach to helping you financially and the math of it, the educational approach to helping you financially. It's an organization called the Financial Therapy Association that has a directory of financial therapists or a financial counselor. So there is the AFCPE. Their website is afcpe.org, and you can get hooked up with an AFC, an accredited financial counselor, to help you work through your money goals, establish money goals, align your values with the goals, and kind of help counsel you through those processes. I think those are professionals that you would want to see in helping to establish safety, certainly in maintaining safety. But beyond establishing that safety, then going through that framework of getting educated, getting the exposure, getting the education, and doing the execution. I think the wonderful thing about couples, and I don't work with couples specifically, and I have not worked with couples, but I think the wonderful thing about couples is the leverage in two heads are better than one. And so you have the accountability, you have the support built into that relationship, and you can share kind of the burden, and not necessarily to share the burden, but you can share the burden financially in establishing kind of what that success looks, not the success, in establishing what safety looks like, and in building and holding each other accountable to the goals and coming up with the goals together, and sharing expenses, et cetera, et cetera. So there's power in that relationship in helping each other navigate the trauma, particularly financial trauma.
Well said. And two heads are often better than one. In my marriage, my wife's head is better than mine. She is really smart. And I guess that's another reason I'm a modern husband, cheering her on in her career. And one final thing, how can our listeners follow you?
Yeah, so I am active on social media, pretty much all the big ones, at my name, Rahkim Sabree. My website is also my name, RahkimSabree.com. And I have a weekly newsletter on Substack called Overcoming Financial Trauma. That is also my name, RahkimSabree.substack.com. So any of those mediums are good to get in contact with me, to get familiar with my content, to engage with me. And I'm an open book, so DMs are open.
Well, this has been a great episode. I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining today. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. We know this is something you often hear, but it truly helps grow our support so we can work to support others. And one final thanks to our sponsor, Money Marriage University. Take your first step today toward healing your pain by visiting moneymarriageuniversity.com. Until next time, be well.